Just let me double check. So it is recording. Fantastic. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Hate Crime Research Seminar. My name is Irene Zempi. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the lead of the NTU Hate Crime Research Group and also a committee member of the BSc Hate Crime Network. Today's Hate Crime Research Group will focus on exploring the barriers to justice for people with learning disabilities, neurodiversity, who have experienced sexual violence, with guest speaker Dr. Helen Williams, Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the University of Sunderland. Helen is an activist and an academic in the social sciences. Her research specialisms include sexual violence and the experience of the criminal justice system for vulnerable or marginalised groups, including learning disabled and neurodivergent victims or witnesses. Ellen is working on an ESRC funded research project with the aim of developing inclusive responses to victim survivors of sexual violence. I will also want to remind you that this webinar takes place as part of UK Disability History Month, which is an annual event creating a platform to focus on the history of struggle for equality and human rights, as well as celebrating the lives of disabled people, challenging ableism and achieving equality for everyone. This presentation will last about 30 minutes and then we will have 20 minutes for questions, thoughts, reflections. The presentation is also being recorded and then it will be shared via the BSc Hate Crime Network YouTube channel. I will now hand over to Ellen.
Thank you very much, Irene. Thank you for having me. I am sharing my screen currently, and when I go into the presentation I won't be able to see the chat, so please feel free to interrupt me with a time warning if needed, because I do really like to talk. So we're here today to talk about barriers to justice for people with learning disabilities and or neurodiversity who've experienced sexual violence. And I've been working on this project with my colleague, Dr. Alison Job from Durham University, who can't be here today, so I'm representing the both of us. A little bit of background, which I don't think will really be any surprise given the audience that we have today. People who have learning disabilities or neurodiversity are at increased risk of sexual violence. There's a huge wealth of evidence that reinforces that, and that's for quite a lot of reasons. It can be due to kind of practical things such as being dependent on carers or a lack of independence more generally. It can be a lack of sex education. It can just be that people are less able to run away, less able to understand that what's happening to them shouldn't be happening. And sometimes it's about communication, about not being able to tell somebody what's happened, so become easy targets for people. Cases in which the victim or survivor has a learning disability or neurodiversity and reports that to the police, they are disproportionately represented in the number of cases that drop out of the criminal justice system. So not getting a charge and not getting a conviction. Now, I think we all know that the charge and conviction rate for sexual violence generally for anybody is very poor across most of the world. But where there is an additional vulnerability, such as a learning disability or neurodiversity, that's even more likely to drop out before a perpetrator is brought to justice. There's evidence from the literature that complaints are less likely to be taken seriously or investigated fully when the person has that additional vulnerability. And when I'm saying additional vulnerability, it's to avoid saying learning disability and or neurodiversity all the way through. But there are also parallels here for people with mental health issues, people who are considered easy targets, such as sex workers, for example. So there are parallels here. And we've found that people with learning disabilities are often constructed as an unreliable witness. And we know in sexual violence cases, credibility is of the utmost importance, much more so than in any other crime. And that really affects case progression through the criminal justice system. So the research that myself and Alison have done, the original project was quite small. It was just exploratory. We were asked by a Rape Crisis Centre to find out a little bit more about victims or survivors with learning disabilities and what was going on with their cases. They kind of identified that they were seeing a lot of women in their service who presented with additional needs, and they wanted to know if that was regional as well. After that original small project, we recruited participants nationally, met people, developed additional partnerships, expanded the work. We're specifically looking at sexual offences here, but the data can be applied more to a broader range of crimes. And as I've said, it's not just about learning disability, it can be disability more broadly, it can be communication issues, can be mental health. So we really wanted to understand what the current situation was, so we could advocate for change, really. And that's kind of where I come in as an academic and an activist. I'm always looking for change. So what we did a couple of years ago now, we interviewed 14 people who work with people with learning disabilities who've reported rape or sexual assault. So those were participants who worked in healthcare, counselling, community work, law. We had specialist police officers, and we had 2 registered intermediaries. Intermediaries, for anybody who doesn't know, that's a speech and language specialist who is able to facilitate communication between police or the courts and somebody with a communication issue. Usually someone who's a speech and language therapist by background, but sometimes a psychologist as well. It's a very specific role. We interviewed 4 women who identified themselves as having learning disabilities and or autism, and they'd all experienced sexual violence and also domestic violence, and their experiences of reporting that to the police. We accessed anonymised case files from our local police force. We were given 4 that were quite heavily redacted. Originally, we expected to have more case files to look at, but we were quite hampered because there was no search facility just for learning disabilities, for example, in the case files. So we were really relying on police officers' memory of, I remember a case in which the victim was identified as such. So we really struggled to make use of those case files because we had such a small amount of data. But because we'd had a little bit of data, we really wanted to see more. So we worked with another police force just this year, and we've had access to 35 case files. So those are the notes that the police have taken during initial report and the investigation stage, when the victim is identified as having a learning disability or neurodiversity. And I'm using neurodiversity to cover a really broad range. Originally, we were just looking at autism, but as we've gone on, we've realised that neurodiversity is a better term to cover a wider range of individuals. So this is what I'm going to present to you today, the findings that help us understand where the barriers are for this group of people and what we might do to challenge some of those barriers. So the key barrier, or one key barrier that we had, was that this community in particular had little trust in the police. Now, I know that there are lots of communities that do not trust the police or have difficult relationships, but it came through particularly strongly in our work. So our community worker said that there's nobody in that group that thinks that police are safe and supportive and somewhere that you could go for help. The social worker that we spoke to said that people were fearful of the police, they don't trust them. And particularly if they've had a negative experience, that shuts them off. And we found a key barrier to justice for this group was disclosure to anybody in the first instance. So many people did not tell anyone at all. And if they did tell somebody, they didn't want to involve police because they didn't trust them to get a good result for them. We found in the case data that some victim survivors only reported the crime to the police because a third party had done so on their behalf. Sometimes that was with the permission of the victim themselves, and sometimes it was without. But we found a trend that people didn't want to speak to the police directly. In one case, it was noted that the individual could not speak directly to police because it would be severely detrimental to their mental well-being. Such was their fear and discomfort around being around the police. And there were, in the case notes, we found reports of people feeling let down when they'd previously reported something to the police and they'd received a dismissive response or something, the kind of process hadn't worked for them. They hadn't gotten the result that they wanted to, and they felt let down. So the first barrier of justice really for this group was about relationships with the police. We also found that police were poor generally at recognising when somebody had a learning disability or neurodiversity and they may need a little bit of extra support or a change in the process. Some of that is about wider community medical educational issues. So as our community worker says, a lot of young women, and it is particularly gendered, a lot of young women's learning differences haven't been recognised or diagnosed. We're currently seeing a jump, particularly in the UK, of women being later diagnosed with things like autism, ADHD, Asperger's, because they haven't been recognised when they were younger. And a former police officer that we spoke to, this was somebody who particularly worked on violence against women and was a very skilled interviewer, speaking to people with additional needs or particularly vulnerable people. And she said, there's a lot of people who live in society that aren't really engaged with the services, you know, their needs haven't been recognised, and they would be the ones that would be missed by police. Now, we're not suggesting that police officers need to be able to make a medical diagnosis, certainly not. But what we are saying is that people were coming into contact with the police and it wasn't being picked up. Police didn't think, oh, perhaps there's something going on here. And they weren't asking. They weren't asking the person, do you have any additional need that we need to be aware of? Is it something that we can put in place that would make this easier for you? It was just being passed over. When it wasn't passed over, when the person who was coming forward to make the report had disclosed that they had an additional need, it wasn't always understood in a way that was useful by the police. And so we have a victim survivor here who identified as autistic. And she said, they put me in the category of higher functioning is the terminology, all sorts of problems with that. And then when she would say in an interview, you know, I can't deal with the lights, there's too much noise going on, I don't understand the way that you're asking things, the police just couldn't understand that. They couldn't understand that she was able to be good at some things and struggle with others. And later on in the same interview, what she'd said was the police had said to her, you know, you're clever, you're doing a PhD, how come you're not understanding the question? And really treated her as if she was being difficult or awkward or purposefully trying not to answer the questions. So there was a real lack of understanding about the way that neurodiversity particularly, but also learning disabilities might impact on the way that a person presented. We found that also there was a lack of consistency in response, and this forms a barrier to justice as well for this group. A good relationship with an officer, a single point of contact who can support somebody through the process, really impacted on that victim's experience of the process. And when people have a good experience, they're more likely to report again in the future. But what we found was that it depended entirely on who you got on the day. Sometimes our interviewees identified really good practice, and then usually what would happen is they would say, oh, the officer was fantastic, really seemed to understand, really helped the person that I was there with. And then later they said, oh, my brother has autism, or my child has a learning disability, or I used to work in a school for young people with learning disabilities. So they'd had some kind of training outside of the police officer role. And that really impacted on the experience that the individual would have. On the flip side, if you got somebody who hadn't got that personal experience, who only kind of had an understanding of learning disabilities or neurodiversity from the media perhaps, or from things that they'd read, or if they thought that it was the kind of thing people were just getting a diagnosis to get some special treatment, for example, which is quite a common thing, unfortunately, then they would have an entirely different response. So really, there was a complete lack of consistency. And the police officer says, if we get a really early identification, so if the victim or the person who's supporting them is able to say, there is a learning disability or there is neurodiversity here, or they have a statement of special educational needs, then the police can prioritise their resources. But without that diagnosis, without that disclosure from the individual or something that would support it going forward, then they're not able to do that. When we looked at the police data, and this goes for both forces that we looked at, we often found that things were poorly recorded. And we're not suggesting that being a police officer is an easy job, or that, you know, they can be expected to do, you know, all of the information that I would want as a researcher. I'm not expecting that they would know that information and would include it. But what we looked at was particularly poor for a few reasons. It's often contradictory, unclear. For example, we were often not able to confirm if what is called an achieving best evidence interview had taken place. So for anybody who doesn't know, after you've made an initial disclosure, police officers do what's called an achieving best evidence interview to take a full statement. Often this was discussed in the notes, but we couldn't see if it had taken place. There was no record if it had actually taken place. Going back to intermediaries facilitating communication, they were often mentioned in the notes, but we couldn't confirm if an intermediary had been present or not. It's often multiple people add into the notes at any given time. In some cases, the vulnerability of the person who was making the report was contested, or the presence of a learning disability or neurodiversity was contested. So we would see in the same case file, the investigation report that says there is a learning disability, a safeguarding report that would say there is no learning disability, this person does not need any special measures, for example. Sometimes it would say that the person was extremely vulnerable, sometimes that would then be contradicted later on. So it's very difficult to pick through. And we also found evidence of dismissive or judgmental language. Again, this goes back to lack of consistency and really who you get on the day and their own personal understandings, their preconceived ideas of how they might write down in your case. But that is also a barrier to justice, because if you have somebody who's making a note using quite judgmental language, and I've got some examples later on, or being quite dismissive of what you've described, then when that evidence is brought forward, that goes to kind of to undermine what you've said. kind of swings the next person that looks at the case file into thinking that this isn't something real, or this hasn't really happened, or this person often does this, that kind of thing. So that was a real barrier to justice. We found that often what was written in the case notes was about feelings of the officer. It wasn't always about facts. And I'll show you some examples later on. We found that the criminal justice system and police particularly were completely inflexible in lots of ways, but particularly this example here. So a counsellor said, you know, we've had cases, it's clearly marked that this person has a learning disability, but then the communication of information happens exactly the same as for anybody else. So they get a letter in the post telling them some details about the investigation or about the decision that's been made. But this person might not be able to read that, certainly not read that on their own in lots of cases, not able to understand the nuances of kind of police speak or that formal language. And so that's almost useless for that person. And what we didn't find is that there was any flexibility with that police officers would come to check if the person would be able to read, if a phone call would be better, if somebody isn't very good on the phone, could they perhaps email? One of the people with lived experience that we spoke to had said that she'd specifically asked the police to communicate via email because using the telephone made her very nervous, and she wouldn't answer if she didn't know who it was, and often police would call from an unknown number. So please could they email? And they said no, that was against policy. She had to be informed by telephone, which then makes it even more stressful and difficult to navigate for somebody. So a real lack of flexibility to modify the process. Similarly, when we had an intermediary, one of them spoke about, you know, discussing with the police, I've done an assessment with this person who's come forward, and really what they don't need is for you to give them a lot of information all at once, because they'll be absolutely overwhelmed. I've talked to them, they understand what needs to happen, but when you go into the room, please can you just start from, you know, less formal, very friendly, and we can just take it from there. And then the police officer would go into the room and start with their spiel from the top in the very formal language. So fearful of getting it wrong or being not following procedure, that they were completely unable to adapt. So there was evidence of that as well. The most significant barrier to justice that we found was communication. And this was a really difficult space for the people that we interviewed. And it also came through in the case files that communication was a key issue. So, for example, we've got Helen who says the police would use their terminology for things and they didn't always explain what they meant. And in my own experience of working with police officers, they absolutely love to use shortened forms of things, or just use initials as a quick way of communicating. But if you're not in the know, if you don't know what that is, then you're completely lost. And Helen talked quite a lot about continually asking for things to be rephrased, or for them to modify things or simplify their communication so that she could understand properly. Emma, another victim survivor that we spoke to, she said that the police really need to understand that that people with learning disabilities find it hard to get the words out. They need more time. That came through very strongly. They need more time. They need to process the question. They need to formulate the answer, and then they will be able to provide a response. And that wasn't always understood by police. So they would take that silence after the question that somebody couldn't or wouldn't answer, and then they would start talking again about something else. They might ask questions, was it this or this or this? And that was too much, and people were confused and couldn't understand. creating an environment where people felt stressed about communicating, about not understanding or how to get their point across, would only exacerbate the communication issues that people felt. So it just created this very difficult space for people to understand and be understood. And one of the key things with communication issues is that it leads to the questioning of the credibility of the person who's making the report. And this is a key issue in sexual violence cases more broadly. We hear about he said, she said. It's one person's word against the other. There's often no forensic evidence, or there aren't any witnesses. Those are difficult crimes to prosecute. And being seen to be a credible person, telling a credible story, was very important. And when you had those communication issues, that meant that credibility was questioned. And that was recognised by our participants as well. So Rebecca, she said, people with autism and learning disabilities, they can't do sequencing, which is telling things in the right order. So it's never taken to court because they're not classified as a credible witness. So she really understood that was an issue. Some things that made credibility be questioned that are often traits of learning disability or neurodiversity would be things like a lack of a linear timeline. We talked about spiral communication, so that people would say one thing and then they would kind of go on to something else, and then they would circle back to the first thing and move on a little bit, and kind of speak in this sort of narrative that came through in our data. But what is needed for a statement is to tell things that happened in the right order. It was this, then it was this, and then it was this. And that proved difficult without any support. We found that people sometimes couldn't be precise, so often this group might have difficulty telling the time, knowing what the date was. So when they're asked to, well, what time was this? They might not be able to answer that properly or accurately. And what we would say to that is, but they might be able to give you a bit of an answer about some, using a different marker of time. So was it before you had your lunch? Was it dark outside? Was it when a particular TV programme was on, or did it happen after? So there are ways around that, not being able to tell the time, for example, that we didn't see any evidence that the police would use. Any inconsistency in an account, any gap in the memory, if you got confused, was it this, was this, well, I can't remember, I'm not sure, would lead to credibility being questioned. And there are lots of ways to kind of mitigate this, but it requires an understanding of learning disabilities and neurodiversity, and also of trauma. I think it's important to say that what we're talking about are people who are coming to ask the police for help after they've suffered a traumatic experience. And there is a wealth of evidence that talks about how trauma impacts on memory, or about the ability to consistently remember something horrible that's happened to you in the same order, without ever remembering an additional detail, or forgetting to include something. It's difficult for anybody to do. It's particularly difficult after trauma, and it's particularly difficult if you have an impairment in those areas. We found use of terminology often made credibility call into account. So this group often used terminology that perhaps might not be accurate the way that other people would understand it. I'll give you an example. So a woman that I worked with many years ago when I worked in a care home used to talk about a boyfriend. And from the use of the term boyfriend, we all might assume that this was a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship, that there was consensual activity happening, because she's used the term boyfriend, and we have those preconceived ideas about what that relationship looks like. And in actual fact, the relationship between them was entirely chaste. There was still boyfriend and girlfriend as they identified themselves, but there was no particular, there was no sexual activity. They'd not been alone together. It was really, as we might understand, a friendship. But the use of that terminology can change the perception of the person that's hearing it, because they think it means something else. Acquiescence or suggestibility, there's quite a bit written about people with learning disabilities who are more likely to go along with what somebody says and say yes, or have things suggested to them that they will kind of go along with. And the example I always use for this one is if anyone's seen Making a Murderer, it's a terrible but great example to illustrate what this means. So you see a young man being interviewed by two police officers, and they just keep feeding more information or kind of asking the question again, suggesting that there's something else to add, and he just keeps adding things that goes way further than what he originally had said. The idea that if somebody asks you a question, you answer it, and then they ask it again, the idea that you've given the wrong answer and you should change it was quite prevalent, both in the practitioners that we spoke to and the people themselves, the people with lived experience. So that can really change a story that's been given, a narrative, and that can go to credibility. And also literal thinking was brought forward. So one of the lived experience women that we've been working with said, you know, if somebody said, come on, we need to leave, get your skates on, that they would look around for skates to put on, because they think literally. How that works in a sexual violence case, well, police might say, well, did you say no? And the victim or survivor might answer, well, I didn't say no, but they might have said many other things. Stop, I don't want to, get off me, leave me alone. You know, so many other things that kind of mean the same. But because they hadn't been asked about that, they would only answer that they hadn't said no. And again, that goes to whether a crime's taken place, reasonable belief of consent. So literal thinking was an issue. Any time that credibility is questioned in a sexual offence, it's not likely to go any further in terms of investigation, charge and conviction, because they are so difficult to prosecute, and they know that that will have to be shared with the defence, and the victim or survivor will be discredited during a trial. So they don't tend to progress any further. Case data reflected that communication was an issue. Also, we found a lot of cases where the police hadn't spoken to a victim or survivor directly at any point before making a decision on the case. So sometimes that was because the victim or survivor didn't want to speak to them because they did not like the police, they did not trust them. Sometimes that was because a third party said, I'll tell you this, speak to me and I will pass on the information. Third parties we found were consistently prioritised. So mother does not want to proceed. Sister does not want to press charges. Dad will not give permission for forensic examination. This was a consistent theme in the case data. Out of the 25 cases that we reviewed, didn't mention an intermediary at all, even though it was very obvious that this person would be eligible to have the special measure, to have communication facilitated. And extensive waiting times for intermediaries constituted a barrier to justice. So sometimes learning disability or neurodiversity was recognised. It was understood that this would prove there would be a barrier to communication, so they would need to have special measure of an intermediary, but then the actual obtaining an intermediary created a barrier to justice. One individual waited 8 months, and in which time they stopped engaging and eventually dropped out of the system. There was at least one other case in the cases we looked at where the wait for an intermediary was so prolonged that the victim or survivor did not want to continue, and they just dropped out. Intermediaries were also poorly understood and underutilised, as I've said. So one support worker said that instead of just getting the intermediary straight away, which we've also seen in the case data didn't happen, they'll exhaust the other options of people who could just act as a person who could sit in on the interview. Trying to save money, the idea that intermediaries was expensive was quite prevalent. So, asking a social worker to sit in, a parent, a care home manager, a support worker to sit in on the interview. Of course, that's not an intermediary, that's not somebody trained to facilitate communication. It's also absolutely crucially not a neutral party. So you've got somebody's a parent or carer sitting in while they tell this extremely personal and traumatic experience. Who wants to talk about that kind of stuff in front of parents or people in position of power of you? There's sometimes a conflict of interest. So we found care home managers sitting in on interviews and facilitating communication after the interview, so between the police and the victim, when in fact the accused person was someone who also lived in the care home, and in one case was a member of staff. So it's a clear conflict of interest there. We also found one case in which a false statement was given by a woman with learning disabilities because her mother was acting as the appropriate person, the intermediary, and she didn't want to disclose a sexual relationship, a consensual sexual relationship that she'd had. So she gave a false statement. So there's all sorts of issues with having non-neutral parties sitting in on those interviews. And I guess what I'm saying is we need to get the appropriate person. We need the intermediary. I had a learning disability nurse as well who'd been asked to be an appropriate adult, who always says no, that you need somebody who is an expert in communication. And just on the last point really is about behaviour. So we find in sexual offences that the behaviour of the person making the complaint, of the victim, the survivor, is often under the microscope, really under scrutiny. The classic ones would be, what were you wearing? How much had you had to drink? Why were you walking home by yourself? These kinds of things. But people with learning disabilities or neurodiversity might have a different framework for perceiving risk, and that came through in the data. So a sexual violence support worker said people don't always have a level of awareness of situations, how that might lead to risk, and that's then used against them. They don't always understand the intentions of others. They might think that if nobody will do them harm, they might have had very sheltered lives, so they don't always perceive the risk in the same way that somebody else might. And we can see this here from Rebecca, who says, some of the things were my fault. I just went with him. It was my fault. I shouldn't have gone with him. Important to note in this case, this was a taxi driver. So it's somebody that people do go with as a matter of course. We all go with taxi drivers to be taken places. But that kind of perception of risk and understanding when the situation changes and how to get out of that situation, how to defend yourself, that understanding is different. I will also say that a key barrier to justice that's evident in that last quote is that level of self-blame that Rebecca has, that she's talking about, it's my fault, I shouldn't have done those things, and that is a barrier to justice for subsequent reporting when people blame themselves. Finally, that kind of under scrutiny, these are all quotes that came out of the case data that we looked at. So very judgmental language, as I mentioned before. So things like that the victim survivor had admitted she was promiscuous, and that was really part of the decision making to take no further action. That someone was going missing and sleeping rough, and that was considered that they were a troubled, difficult person with many issues, rather than that behaviour might be a result of the trauma that they'd faced. Doesn't look distressed, that was from CCTV. Someone reported something that had happened in a public place, and the police officer notes that it doesn't look distressed, and that's a reason. They think it didn't happen, so no further action. Something Partner swapping is quite a judgmental term to use. What had happened in this case was the victim had been in a group of 4 people in a house, which the police officer has described as partner swapping. But in this case, there was also messages from the perpetrator to the victim admitting that the offence had taken place. And yet what is actually written is that this was partner swapping. And again, no further action was taken on that. And finally, telling lies. She always does this. She's known for telling lies. She makes false allegations. That was in a number of cases that we looked at. And crucially, previous allegations that hadn't gone anywhere, that hadn't resulted in a charge, were considered undermining evidence, rather than, on the flip side, evidence of multiple experiences of victimisation. So, for example, a reason for not investigating any further would be the existence of 3 previous reports of rape made by the victim. There are a significant number of crimes recorded against the victim, which brings her credibility into question. So really not looking at multiple victimisation and that vulnerability to victimisation that I talked about right at the beginning, increased vulnerability to sexual violence, but looking at multiple reports that haven't gotten a charge as being evidence of lying. So the implications of this, just to round up really quickly, I wanted to highlight some of the key issues faced by learning disabled or neurodiverse victims of crime. And this is definitely not a full stop. This is not the whole story. It's just what I could quickly fit in a presentation, but some of the key issues that affect this group of people. If you can't access justice, you increase vulnerability to further victimisation. I think that comes through in the data. But what one of the participants actually says is, as a society, what we say is, choose somebody with a learning disability. Nobody will believe them and you'll get away with it. So you're actually inviting further targeting of this population if you don't allow access to justice and if we know that the system's working against them. There was a link between being diagnosed with and disclosing that diagnosis and then being able to access the special measures which helped you give the best evidence, but that was in conflict with sometimes when an additional need was disclosed and then they were just constructed as not credible because of their additional need, because of their learning disability. So there's a real tension between those two things, and it's risky to disclose. It wasn't certain to lead you on to the special measures and the additional help that you might think. So myself and Alison, we argue that the current system's inherently ableist. It doesn't support individualisation, it doesn't support person-centred. I would add, it doesn't support a trauma-informed approach that would benefit all victims and survivors of serious crime. And we need to work on that. I think we need to advocate for change. So what we've done, myself and Alison, we've developed training and resources for the police and other practitioners to raise awareness. I've done this presentation in various forms to various audiences, speaking about it, trying to get the word out. The training that we developed went down really well. We got overwhelmingly positive feedback, and so we'd like to roll that out further. And we've also created some resources with a group of women with learning disabilities who have experienced sexual and domestic violence. Together we created some resources to help police communicate and provide a better response for that group. And all of that work is available on that website. Articles that we've written, some of the stuff that's been written up currently, but the resources and talk of the description of the training is all there on that website. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ellen. This was really informative. I will stop recording now so we can have